Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week we're going to be taking a look at a very sweet and spicy green and white Bloodbriar deck. So, what this essentially does is it plays Bloodbriar, mostly, and the entire deck is built around it. So Bloodbriar says, 2 and a green for a 2/3 plant elemental creature. Whenever you sacrifice another permanent, put a 1/1 counter on Bloodbriar. So the entire point of the deck is to get this guy really big by sacrificing permanents. So sacrificing permanents is sacking lands, sacking creatures, sacking clues, that kind of thing. And we're doing all of those in this deck. So it's very sweet. And this guy is pretty much going to be the way that we end most games. We have plenty of ways of getting him through for the final bit of damage as well. And a pretty sweet combo that I'll get to in a second. You may notice it as I swing right to the beginning of the deck. Right at the beginning of the deck is the protection suite. So if you are going to go for a deck that uses a singular creature that has no kind of evasion of any kind, then you want to make sure that you are protecting your creature. So to start off with, we've got Blossoming Defense. So for 1 green, instant speed, target creature you control gets +2/+2 and gains hexproof until the end of the turn. So I should note as well, this deck, I first built it just before Kaladesh set was released, I think. Something like that. And there wasn't very good protection spells for Bloodbriar, so I never actually showed you guys this deck because it just wasn't good enough. But with Blossoming Defense, we now have a 1-mana answer to keep our Bloodbriar safe, as opposed to like a 4-mana give X-proof spell, which was just like, yeah, it's just unreasonable. So we've got Blossoming Defense now, which makes this deck quite viable, quite fun, and, you know, fairly competitive. It's more fun than competitive, I would say, but it's got a lot of spice to it. Next, we've got Selfless Spirit. Yet again, another way to protect our Bloodbriar and as well the rest of our board. So for 1 and a white, we get a 2/1 flying Spirit Cleric that says, sacrifice Selfless Spirit. Creatures you control gain indestructible until the end of the turn. And that is also a sacrifice ability on a card, which will give a +1/+1 counter to Bloodbriar. So in giving Bloodbriar a counter and indestructible, you pretty much have both of those set into Selfless Spirit, which is pretty sweet. Next we have Lunik, Mantle. You may never have seen that card, and there's a good reason for it. It's crap. However, it's pretty good in this deck. So for 1 and a white, Enchantment Aura. You get to enchant creature. We're going to be enchanting Bloodbriar with this, so keep that in mind as I read this. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has pay 1, sacrifice a permanent. This creature gains flying until the end of the turn. So if we stick Lunik Mantle onto a Bloodbriar, we pay 1 to sacrifice a permanent, which includes lands, includes more specifically the land you use to spend on the ability. You give it flying and it gets +1/+1. So when we're ready, we will protect Bloodbriar with absolutely everything we have in our arsenal. We will give it evasion and we will sack absolutely everything on our board, very much like Affinity style. And every single time we sacrifice a permanent, we get a counter. So we pay 1, we sack a land, we get a counter. It gains flying, which is evasion in itself, might just be enough to get it through. If not, we do have trample and other things like that. But every single land you play is another trigger for the mantle. So you can essentially count your number of lands as how much Bloodbriar is going to get. So this is a really good way to sneak a win out of your opponent, because they really don't expect this half of the time. If you put this down straight away, then they've never known it existed up till this point, and they quickly find out that all of your lands are actually a +1/+1 spell, which is pretty awesome. Only 2 of, because it is really crap, except for when it's on a Bloodbriar or when a Bloodbriar is on the battlefield anyway. So we don't want to see too many of them. We only need the 1, really, because we're going to keep our Bloodbriar safe, whichever one has this attached to it. But it's pretty sweet. We then have Evolutionary Leap. This is a way to find our Bloodbriars. It's also a sacrifice outlet as well. So for 1 and a green enchantment, pay 1 green, sacrifice a creature. So we get counters on our Bloodbriar. And we get to reveal cards from the top of our library until we reveal a creature card. Put that into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So we get to thin out a deck of all of our creatures If our opponent just got rid of our Bloodbriar, we sacrifice it and we go get another one, essentially. We're quite likely to hit them very, very commonly, because it is a common, so there's 4 of them, so we get to see them quite often. And also, if our opponent tries to remove anything at all, we just sack it in response, and we get to keep maintaining that card advantage, so every single removal spell just gets us another creature, essentially. So it can be really bad for our opponent, and it's absolutely awesome. We then have Bygone Bishop, so for 2 and a white, a 2/3 Flying Spirit Cleric again. When you cast a creature spell with converted mana cost 3 or less, you get to investigate. And by investigate, you get a clue token, which has pay 2, sacrifice this artifact, and draw a card. So it gets us loads and loads of clue tokens, which we can then sacrifice, get a counter on our Bloodbriar, and also draw cards in turn as well. As for the amount of triggers we get on Bygone Bishop, creature spells with converted mana cost 3 or less is essentially all of our creatures. We only have Brunner and Gisela that won't trigger it. So we've got 3 Filigree Familiars, we've got 4 Bloodbriars, 2 Trialist Trackers, a Nyssa, the other Bygone Bishop, and our Selfless Spirits. All of them will trigger the Bygone Bishop and get us lots of clue tokens, which is lots of card advantage, and it's lots of sacrifice triggers for our Bloodbriar. Next we have Nyssa Vastwood Seer. So this is kind of a mana-heavy deck in a way, but we don't want to be running too many lands, because we don't want to get flooded, and we have no ways of getting 2 or more lands on the battlefield per turn anyway. So we've got Nyssa instead. So for 2 and a green, a 2/2 legendary creature, Elf Scout. When she enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest and reveal it and put it into your hand. We do use a lot of forests over plains. Evolutionary Leap, for example, uses a single green source in order to use its ability. Blossoming Defense. I am tripping over my words all day today. I don't know why. Also uses 1 green mana, so we need a lot of green mana, but we're a very balanced deck when it comes to the late game. But having that forest is pretty sweet. Whenever a land enters a battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, exile Nyssa and return her to the battlefield transformed under her owner's control. And she transforms into Nyssa Sage Animus. So for 3 loyalty planeswalkers, she's got a fair few useful abilities here. In fact, they're all useful in their own way. +1, reveal the top card of your library. If it is a land, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. So this is a good way of ramping if we hit a land. Otherwise, it's just decent card advantage. We get a creature or a pump spell from Nyssa's +1 here. And it's just ultimately awesome. Her -2 is put a legendary 4/4 green elemental creature token named Ashaya, the Awoken World, onto the battlefield. So it's just a 4/4, decent blocker to protect Nyssa if it need be. And it's also another sacrifice target for Evolutionary Leap, or even just that final little bit of damage to get in and finish our opponent off. Finally, they've got the -7 ability, personal favourite, usually wins a game straight out of using it. Untap up to 6 target lands. They become 6/6 elemental creatures, and they're still lands. So 6 6/6s is a lot of damage, and usually your opponent can't really do much about it. And if they can do something about it, you're going to leave them very, very weakened by the end of the attack, and you're just probably going to kill them the turn after anyway. But they don't stop being creatures as well, so you can keep swinging in for them for the rest of the game. And they're out of languish range as well, which is nice. Next we have Tireless Tracker. So 2 and a green for a 3/2 human scout. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you investigate. Investigate, as we mentioned, makes a clue token. Whenever you sacrifice a clue, put a 1/1 counter on Tireless Tracker. So this is our more useful Bloodbriar for the most part. So this one gives us clue tokens when we play lands, and it gets essentially the same Bloodbriar ability, but just for clues. Can get out of hand as well, so it's a great alternative for a other swinging in ability as well if we want to murder someone another way. Not really, because Bloodbriar is very fun. We've talked about Bloodbriar, let's get on to Filigree Familiar. So for 3 mana of any colour, we get a 2/2 Fox artifact. Whenever Filigree Familiar enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life. Can really help out in a tricky situation against aggro. It's also a 2/2 blocker as well, which we're more than happy to block with, because when it dies, you get to draw a card. It's also great sacrifice fodder as well, because we do want it to die in some way or another. And when we do, we get to draw a card. So if we sack this to a Evolutionary Leap, we draw a card, and then we go search for another creature out of our deck. So it's pretty sweet. And it's just ultimately a really good card to be sacrificing. Then we've got Pulse of Murasa. This is decent life gain. It's mostly why it's in here, but we also get to pull back lands like Evolving Wilds, or even our creatures like Bloodbriar as well if we need a decent attacker. So for 2 and a green, instant speed, return a creature or land, gain 6 life. Speaks for itself. If we get Bloodbriar on the field, we want to keep chaining together Evolving Wilds and stuff like that to keep sacrificing lands, because it's a free sack, essentially, on an Evolving Wilds, which makes it pretty awesome. We then have 2 wild sides. This is the other way that we're planning on getting through our opponent. So if flying will not work for us, then we need to go through our opponent. If we can't go over them, we'll go through them. 2 and green, instant speed, target creature gets +2/+2 and gains trample until the end of the turn, and then you draw a card. So, it speaks for itself. If we can't get a flyer over, we'll go a trampler over. Usually Bloodbriar is like 11 power, so there's nothing really that's going to block that can really stop Bloodbriar once it's got trample to get that last bit of damage in. So that's our other option. We then have Angelic Purge. This is the removal in our deck. So for 2 and a white, as an additional cost to cast Angelic Purge, sacrifice a permanent. Usually a bad thing. However, by sacrificing permanents, we get counters on our Bloodbriar. And we also have decent options for sacrificing as well. We can sacrifice Filigree Familiars to draw cards. We can also sacrifice Drownyard Temples and pay 3 to get them back onto the battlefield. And we can just sacrifice lands or Scion tokens with From Beyond or stuff like that. We have plenty of ways of this to not be a downside for us. The upside to using Angelic Purge is it's pretty good removal for just about everything. You get to exile target artifact, creature, or enchantment. So it gets rid of Ulamog, it gets rid of Sphinx's Tutelage, it gets rid of Gear Hulks. It's got a lot of applications, so it's pretty sweet. We then have Gisela. So you may notice in the first game that we're actually running what's it called? Uvenwald Mysteries. It's because I'm actually recording this after the first 2 games of the first match. So we ended up swapping them out with Gisela here. So we're going for the Gisela-Priscilla combo because we are cycling through our deck, getting a lot of creatures into play. And having Gisela isn't necessarily a bad thing. I thought I might as well try out Priscilla. So far, I've not managed to pull it off, but not actually had the opportunity to do it either, so we'll see. But by herself, she is a 2 and 2 white, 4/3 flying first strike lifelinking creature, which is pretty awesome. And she says at the beginning of your end step, if you own both Gisela and Priscilla, you get to exile them and meld them into Priscilla Voice of Nightmares, and this will shut down a game by itself as well. So you can call this an alternative win con, essentially. So a 4/3 first striking lifelinker turns into a 9/10 flying first striking vigilant lifelinker. And also, your opponents can no longer cast spells with converted mana cost 3 or less. Can't cast Reprisal, can't cast Declaration in Stone, can't cast Anguish Stunmaking. Most of the removal is officially out of the question once Priscilla comes down, so it can really shut down a game and absolutely stop your opponent from doing anything of use. So if we can get her solidly stuck on that battlefield, we're probably going to win, short of a board wipe. We then have From Beyond. This is our way of getting into Priscilla, by the way, and it's also a really good way of sacrificing things. So From Beyond says 3 and a green, enchantment with Devoid, not relevant. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a 1/1 colourless Eldrazi Scion token onto the battlefield and has the ability to sacrifice itself and gain 1 mana of colourless variety. So it's ramp for us. It allows us to get into our Brunner, because Brunner is quite expensive. She is 7 mana, so if we want to get into Brunner, we want to be able to get there pretty soon, and From Beyond kind of allows us to do that as well. Alternatively though, every single time we use the mana from a Scion, we're getting a counter on our Bloodbriar, so we can sack our entire board of our Scions, get tons of counters on our Bloodbriar, so it's a great way to sacrifice stuff and progress the board. We don't actually have a target for the second ability, but what you can do is if you need that one extra counter from your Bloodbriar and you have nowhere else to do it, you can actually just pay the 2 mana, sacrifice from beyond, and fail to find any card, because we don't have any Eldrazi cards that you can actually search for. So the second ability is useless, but it still has a use in very rare circumstances. So we got 2 copies of that. Next we've got Tamio's Journal. 5 mana, legendary artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, you investigate. So we make clue tokens. We all know how good they are. And we also have the ability to tap, sacrifice 3 clues, search your library for any card you want, and put it into your hand. So that's 3 sacrifices for our clues. That's 3 triggers on Bloodbriar. And it's also a tutor for absolutely any card. So if we have Gisela on the battlefield or in the graveyard, we tutor for Brunner, we cast Brunner. And now we have Bracella, and we have loads and loads of clues for the rest of the game, and it's just going to close it out. Only running 1 copy though, because it is a bit slow, but if you can get it going, then it's pretty sweet. Next we have Tragic Arrogance. We're using this over Planar Outburst for several reasons. One, because we don't want to lose our Bloodbriar if we're using it. Check, we can do that. For 3 and 2 white, for each player, you choose from among them permanents that player controls, an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a planeswalker. And then each player sacrifices the rest, as long as they're non-lands. So, if we're playing up against Super Friends and our opponent's got several planeswalkers, they only get to keep 1. So you get to keep the one that they are weakest to. We get to keep our creature, so we get to swing into them. And we can pretty much make our board state pretty nice. What we can do, though, is because each player sacrifices all of these permanents, if we've got a ton of clues on the battlefield and a Bloodbriar, we can actually just keep Bloodbriar and leave that as our only card that we've got. Everything else gets sacrificed, so for everything that leaves the battlefield on our side, we get another counter on Bloodbriar. So this is a board wipe, and it's potentially a game ender in itself as well. So it's pretty sweet. We then have Brunner. We've talked about Brunner, but Brunner's ability, which makes her very useful, is she's a 5/7 with flying and vigilance. But when you cast her, you get to return target angel or human from your graveyard to the battlefield. So we want to grab Gisela if we can. Alternatively, we don't actually have many good targets. We only really have Tireless Tracker, but that's a good target in itself. So it's not too bad. But mostly, we've got a single one in here for trying to get the Bracella combo going. That's going to be the deck anyway, guys. Let's go on to the mana base. We've got 6 plains and 6 forests. Speaks for itself. We're quite evenly balanced all the way up the board as well. We do eventually want a higher skew in forest, but in the early game we want a bit of both. So we've gone for an even mana base here. We then have Canopy Vista that says it enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. We run 12, so it's very likely these guys will be coming into play untapped, especially in the late game, so it's a pretty decent card. And it's also a forest and a plains, which will become relevant in a moment. We then have Westvale Abbey. Westvale Abbey says add colourless to your mana pool, but we can also pay 5 and pay 1 life and put a 1/1 white and black human cleric token onto the battlefield, so we can get extra blockers, extra sacrifice targets for Evolutionary Leap, and also we can allow us to build our board towards our final ability, which says pay 5, sacrifice 5 creatures and transform Westvale Abbey. So if we sacrifice 5 creatures, that's 5 counters on our Bloodbriar, and we also get to transform into Ormondal, the Profane Prince. 9/7 legendary creature with flying, lifelink, indestructible, and haste. This usually ends a game. So once Westvale Abbey's on the board, your opponent should probably become really conscious about the amount of creatures you've got. So they'll be trying to take down our Scion tokens because we've got plenty of them, which is pretty sweet. So we've got plenty of opportunities to get Ormondal onto the battlefield with the amount of creatures we can potentially get. But for the most part, we're going to be focusing on a single creature. So if we have 6 creatures and one of them's a Bloodbriar, then we're going to have both Ormondal and Bloodbriar, which is going to be awesome. We then have Sun Petal Grove. Enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a forest or a plains. We've got 12 forests and plains, but we also have Canopy Vista, which is a forest and a plains as well, which allows Sun Petal Grove to come into play untapped. Drownyard Temple, we briefly mentioned this. It adds a colourless mana to your mana pool and it's also a great sacrifice outlet for us, because once we sacrifice it, once it goes into the graveyard, we get to return it from our graveyard to the battlefield if we pay 3 mana. So we can potentially ramp up if our opponent's milling us or anything like that. We can potentially ramp with it by paying 3 and getting this back on our opponent's turn or something like that. But it's a great sacrifice outlet because things like Angelic Purge, which we sacrifice permanence with, we just select Drownyard Temple because we have the ability to get it back. So essentially we can just do it whenever we want, really. Next we have Evolving Wilds. We have 4 of. Usually these are stuck to landfall decks and 3 coloured decks or more, but we actually want to sacrifice a lot of things. So Evolving Wilds allows us to sacrifice, search our library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. When we sacrifice Evolving Wilds, we get a counter on our Bloodbriar, and we also thin out our deck, so it's really good and synergizes quite well with the deck. Alright guys, that is going to be the deck. I hope you enjoyed the look of it, and if you did, then be sure to check out the matches that should be following shortly after this. Be sure to leave a like, helps me out a great deal, lets me know you're enjoying the series, and if you haven't already, then be sure to subscribe for more Magic Duels content and crazy decks like Bloodbriar. And if you have subscribed and haven't already, then be sure to hit that little bell icon right next to the subscription button. It notifies you when I release new videos. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.